The Vikings came from three countries of Scandinavia: Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The name Viking comes from a language called Old Norse and means a pirate raid. People went off raiding in ships were said to be going a Viking. The Viking Age in European history lasted from 700 to 1100. During this period, many Vikings left Scandinavia and traveled to other countries, such as Britain and Ireland. Some went to fight and steal treasure. Others settled in new lands as farmers, craftsmen, or traders. In 793, Vikings first became of note when they attacked the Christian monastery at Lindisfarne in Northumbria. They were pagans, not Christians like most people in Britain. A Viking robber did not think twice about robbing a Christian church. Christian monasteries in Britain were easy to attack because the monks in the monasteries had no weapons. Churches and monasteries kept valuable treasures, such as gold, jewels, and books. There was food, drink, cattle, clothes, and tools, which were tempting for the Vikings. Viking ships brought families to Britain looking for land to farm. Good farmland was scarce in the Vikings' own countries. The parts of Britain where most Vikings settled were in the north and east. These areas of England became known as Danelaw. Norwegian Vikings sailed west across the Atlantic Ocean to Iceland and Greenland. About 1000 AD, Vikings sailed to North America and started a settlement, though it did not last long. Danish Vikings went to France and founded Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Danish Vikings also sailed south around Spain and into the Mediterranean Sea. Swedish Vikings roamed along the rivers into Russia. Viking traders, known as Varangians, could be found as far east as Constantinople, where they met people from Africa, Arabia, and Asia. Most Viking men were all-around handymen, but some had special skills. They were boat builders, for example, and potters, leather workers, and smiths. Most Viking men knew how to handle a boat, and most could fight if they had to protect the family or support their chieftain. Women baked bread. They did spinning and weaving to turn sheep wool into cloth. They looked after the children, made the family's clothes, and cooked the 2 meals a day most families ate. On the farm, women milked the cows and made cheese. Blacksmiths sweated over fires, hammering red-hot iron. They made iron tools, knives, and swords. To make a sword, the smith twisted and hammered iron rods until he had a gleaming, sharp-edged blade. A good sword would not snap in battle. Viking smiths also made iron nails, rivets to hold a ship together, spurs for horse riding, locks and keys, arrowheads, and belt buckles. Smiths traveled from village to village, repairing tools and cooking pans. Kings and chieftains had their own smiths. Many people thought smiths were wizards, making magic out of smoke and flames. Babies were given little Thor's hammer charms to protect them from evil spirits and sickness. A boy usually took his father's name too. So Eric, son of Carl, became Eric Carlson. Girls often took the same name as their mother or grandmother. Viking children did not go to school. They helped their parents at work and learned Viking history, religion, and law from spoken stories and songs, not from books. By the age of 15 or 16, they were adult. It was common for a girl's father to choose her husband. Most children's toys were homemade. Whistles made from leg bones of geese, for example. Children had wooden dolls, played football, and sailed model boats. Pig bones found at Viking sites might be toy hummers. The bones were threaded on a twisted cord which you pulled to make a humming noise. A young man might go off on a trading voyage or become a raider. He hoped to come home rich so he could buy a farm. Vikings met at markets, like the markets at Hedby in Denmark or Jorvik in England. They traded by exchanging goods, but also used gold and silver coins. Traders valued coins by weight and carried small folding scales to weigh a customer's coins. Viking men enjoyed swimming, wrestling, and horse racing. In winter, people skated on frozen rivers and used skis over the snow. A favorite board game was the King's Table. Players moved pieces around the board like in chess. There were lots of versions of this game. Not everyone was free to come and go as he liked, or she liked. Some people were slaves, or thralls. Slaves did the hardest, dirtiest jobs. People could be born slaves. The child of a slave mother and a slave father was a slave too. But the child of a slave mother and a free father was free. Many slaves were people captured in a Viking raid. Slave traders sold slaves in markets. The Vikings built fast ships for raiding and war. These ships were dragon ships, or longships. The Vikings also had slower passenger and cargo ships called knors. They built small boats for fishing or short trips. Viking longships could sail in shallow water, so they could travel up rivers as well as across the sea. In a raid, a ship could be hauled up on a beach. The Vikings could jump out and start fighting, and then make a quick getaway if they were chased. A ship was built beside a river or an inlet of the sea. A tall oak tree was cut to make the keel. The builders cut long planks of wood for the sides and shorter pieces for supporting ribs and crossbeams. They used wooden pegs and iron rivets to fasten the wooden pieces together. Overlapping the side planks, known as clinker building, made the ship very strong. People stuffed animal wool and sticky tar from pine trees into every joint and crack to keep out the water. To launch the ship, the Vikings pushed it into the water. They slid it over log rollers to make the pushing easier. A Viking ship had one big square sail made of woven wool. In some ships, the mast of the sail could be folded down. When there was not enough wind for the sail, the men rowed with long wooden oars. To steer the ship, one man worked a big steering oar at the end, or astern. At the curved front end of the ship was a carved wooden figurehead. A dragon ship had room for 40 to 60 men. The men slept and ate on deck. There was some space below deck for storage, but no cabins. Vikings sailed close to the coast whenever possible, watching for landmarks. Out of sight of land, they looked for the sun. West towards the sunset meant that they were headed for England. East towards the sunrise meant they were headed home to Denmark or Norway. The Vikings invented a kind of sun compass to help find their way. At night they watched the stars. Seamen knew a lot about winds and sea currents. By watching birds or even the color of the water, an experienced sailor could tell when land was close. The Vikings did not send many ships on their raids. They made surprise attacks on isolated places. They knew they would not have to fight a large army. Medieval kings were too busy fighting one another to join forces against the Vikings. There were no navies to guard the coast, so it was easy for Vikings to land on a beach or sail up a river. After raiding, the ship sailed home loaded with treasures and captives. The Vikings fought using long swords and axes. A good sword was handed down from father to son, but Vikings also buried weapons with their owner when he died. Wood rots, metal rusts away after thousands of years or more in the ground, but some remains show what the Viking weapons look like. Vikings did not wear much armor, though. Some chieftains wore mail coats. Most relied on a round wooden shield for protection. On their heads they wore helmets made of leather or iron. A Viking saying was, "Never leave your weapons behind when you go to work in the fields. You may need them." Most people lived on farms. Farmers used iron tools such as sickles and hoes. They grew oats, barley, and wheat, and ground the grain to make flour, porridge, and ale. Vikings grew vegetables such as onions, beans, and cabbages. Their farm animals included pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, geese, and chickens. They used manure from the animals to keep the soil fertile. In autumn, farmers killed some animals because there was not enough food to feed them all through the winter. Viking houses were built of wood, stone, or blocks of turf, depending on the local materials. The houses were long box-shaped, with sloping, thatched, or turf roofs. The walls were made of wattle, woven sticks covered with mud to keep out the wind and rain. The floor of a Viking house was often dug below ground level. Perhaps this helped keep out drafts. Most houses had just one room for a family to share. Rich people's farmhouses might have a small entrance hall, a large main hall, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a storeroom. In a Viking town, houses were crowded close together along narrow streets. Jobs such as collecting wood for the fire and weaving and baking bread took up a lot of time. Vikings did not have much furniture, perhaps a wooden table and benches for sitting on and sleeping on. There were no bathrooms in Viking homes. Most people probably washed in a wooden bucket or at the nearest stream. Instead of toilets, people used cesspits, holes dug outside for toilet waste. The pit was usually screened by a fence. Slimy, muddy cesspits have been found by archaeologists studying the remains of Viking towns. From bones, seeds, and other food remains at Viking sites, we know they ate meat from farm animals and from wild animals they hunted, and collected foods such as berries and nuts. They cooked meat in a big stew pot over the fire, or roasted it in an iron spit. Fish and meat were smoked or dried to preserve it. Viking bread was made from rye or barley flour. They used milk mostly to make cheese and butter, then drank the buttermilk left over. At a feast, Vikings drank ale and mead, a strong drink made from honey. People drank out of wooden cups or drinking horns made from cow horns. Feasts were held to mark funerals and seasonal festivals such as midwinter. Some feasts lasted over a week. In Viking society, the strongest leaders were jarls, or earls. The most powerful jarls became kings. Freemen met at the Thing, or Viking assembly. People, men and women, met in the open air to settle problems, such as deciding who owned land or farm animals, and to punish criminals. They met old friends, swapped news, and arranged marriages. Viking laws were passed from parents to children by word of mouth. People who broke the law became outlaws, and anyone could kill them. The family was important to every Viking. An argument might end in a fight. If someone was killed, the dead man's family saw it as their right to take revenge. His relatives tried to punish the killer and the killer's family. This led to long and violent blood feuds between families. These feuds could be ended by one side paying blood money to the other as compensation. Women were important in Viking family life. A woman kept the keys to the chest holding the family valuables. She ran the home and farm while her husband was away trading or fighting. The Vikings had their own pagan religion. They worshipped many gods. The old stories they told about gods, giants, and monsters were known as Norse myths. Odin was the ruler of the gods, and the god of magic, poetry, and war. His wife was the motherly Frigg. Freya was the goddess of love and fertility, and wept golden tears when she was unhappy. Red-headed Thor ruled the skies, storms, and thunder. He had iron gloves, a magic belt, and a hammer called Mjolnir. People loved Thor but did not trust Loki, the mischievous trickster god. A dead person was buried or cremated with some of his belongings to take to the next world. Some Viking chiefs were given ship burials with treasure, weapons, and favorite dogs and horses buried with them. Vikings believed that a warrior killed in battle went to Valhalla, a great hall where dead heroes feasted at long tables. Odin sent his warrior maidens, the Valkyries, riding through the skies to bring dead warriors to Valhalla. The Vikings told stories how people lived in Midgard, or Middle Earth, along with giants, elves, and dwarfs. The gods and goddesses lived in a sky world called Asgard. Linking Midgard with Asgard was a rainbow bridge. The Vikings told many tales of monsters such as trolls, dragons, and sea serpents. However, not much is known about how the Vikings worshipped their old gods. It's thought they had magic trees and perhaps wooden temples. Some Vikings may have killed captives as human sacrifices. These old pagan customs died out after the Vikings became Christians. Viking leaders founded churches and put up painted stone crosses. However, some Vikings continued to follow their own religion at the same time. The Vikings traded all over Europe and as far east as Central Asia. They bought goods and materials such as silver, silk, spices, wine, jewelry, glass, and pottery. In return, they sold items such as honey, tin, wheat, wool, wood, iron, fur, leather, fish, and walrus ivory. Everywhere they went, the Vikings brought and sold slaves. Traders carried folding scales for weighing coins to make sure they got a fair deal. The Vikings were brave sailors and explorers. Families were ready to risk their lives on long, dangerous journeys to find new land to farm. Vikings sailed out into the North Atlantic Ocean and south to the Mediterranean Sea looking for lands to settle. They sailed to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. They found their way by looking for landmarks, such as islands and distant mountains. Vikings from Norway sailed to Iceland in the late 800s. One of the Icelandic Vikings was Eric the Red, and in 983 he sailed off west to Greenland. Greenland is much bigger than Iceland and much colder too. It is not much good for farming. Eric hoped the name Greenland would attract farmers, but not many Vikings went there. A Viking called Bjorn Hyrelson discovered America by accident in the year 985. He saw an unknown land after his ship was blown off course on his way from Iceland to Greenland. In 1001, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west to find this new land. Leif and his men were the first Europeans to have landed in America. They spent the winter in a place named Vinland. It was in present-day Newfoundland, Canada. But after fights with local Native American people, the Vikings gave up their settlement.